Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to the channel. This is another video in my newbie's guide to Lightburn. And in this video, we're going to be going through the settings menu and all the different options that are in there and the ones that I personally use and why. And you may want some different ones, but I'm going to show you what I do. So let's get right into Lightburn and get going on it. Now, the way you access the settings menu is in Windows, it's actually under the Edit menu and Settings. And the Mac, it's in the Lightburn menu, Preferences. But the quickest way is just go right up here on the top toolbar. You'll see the gears icon. That'll bring you right into the settings. Okay. So when it opens up with the main editor settings window open. And we're just going to start at the top and work our way down through. The autosave interval, I have mine set to 0 because I don't use the autosave. I like living on the edge. If you put any value other than 0 in the autosave interval, that is the time in minutes that will be between autosaves. So if the program should crash for whatever reason, you'll have a backup copy there, at least up to that point. Moving right across, automatically check for updates. I leave that on because I like to know when a new version comes out, and I may not always update right away. If that's checked, it'll give you a pop-up on the screen saying, hey, there's a new version available. And right below that it says Use System Clipboard. I leave that checked as well because that allows you to copy and paste across different versions, like, if you have multiple windows open or anything else from your operating system. If you have that unchecked, you can only copy and paste internally in the program. So I find that to be a very useful feature, to be able to copy and paste from everywhere on your computer. Now back over to the left side, beginner mode. When Lightburn starts up, it's going to be in beginner mode. I'm going to recommend you turn that off from the get-go because that disables several features, and they are advanced features, but there are times even as a beginner where you want some of those features available to you. So I'm going to recommend turning off beginner mode and just going to normal mode. Now coming on down, ignore out-of-bound shapes if possible. That is if you have a graphic on your work area, and that's mainly if you're working in absolute coordinates. If you have a graphic on your work area that's partway inside the work grid and partway outside the work grid, Lightburn will not allow it to burn anything that's outside the work grid. Otherwise, it will cause your system to crash into the rails, and we don't want to do that. So I suggest leaving that turned on. Invert mouse wheel zoom direction. That's more of a Mac feature than anything else because the default mouse wheel setting on a Mac is just opposite of the way my brain works. And if you need to, if you don't like the way the mouse wheel works in Lightburn, click that button and it'll work just opposite. So, play error sound if file send fails. That's self-explanatory. Save cut selected selection origin to project. I like to have that on because as I save a project, I want it to save if I had cut selected on or not. I want it to save what my origin settings were. I want all that to come in the project. That way when I reload the project, it'll be back the same way I had it. What I don't do is I don't turn on default cut selected state and default use selection origin state. If you turn those on, that means every time you open Lightburn, that is going to be turned on. And most of the time I don't want to use those functions personally. So, but if you always only want to use cut selected state, only want to use cut selected, then turn that on by all means. Going back over here to the right. Ignore start button if monitor is off or asleep. That's very handy with a diode laser, and I think it might affect galvo lasers also. But if you're running a job, say you're running a job that's going to take an hour, and your monitor goes to sleep in 30 minutes. Well, the job's going to keep running. You come back and you want to wake your computer up. I've always just hit the space bar, and that wakes the computer back up. Well, in Lightburn, the start button, if that was the last thing that was clicked, When you hit the space bar, it's going to restart because it's going to trigger that. So this ignore start button, if it's off asleep, that will keep that from restarting a job on you. I suggest having that turned on. And over here, save job log. That actually creates a text file on your computer of all the different jobs you've done and that type of information. I have no use for that. You might. Back to the left, save job origin to project. So if you have your origin set up as user origin or absolute coordinates or whatever, and whether it was center or bottom left, top right, it will save that information into save file. Save state of move, scale, and rotate switches. Down here on the bottom, and you can't see them right now because I have this window open, but you have some green check boxes, move, rotate, scale. If you turn those off, that will prevent you from being able to perform those operations. I've never turned off any of those. I always leave those on, so I have no reason to do anything with this. So load default layer settings on new or restart. That is a highly important feature in my mind. If that is not checked, every time Lightburn starts up or every time Lightburn closes, whatever settings you have in every layer setting, when it reopens, that's the settings that'll come on. That'll be loaded back up. Maybe you were working on a project and you had tabs enabled or perforation mode or something, and you start a new project and you go to burn it and you didn't realize that you had that selected last time. Well, without the default selected, that's still going to be set, and you can ruin a project that way. Where if you have the load default layer settings checked, that will, every time Lightburn starts, it'll wipe out any settings changes you've made and revert back to the default settings. Now, it goes to Lightburn's default settings primarily, but in every layer you can set your own default for that layer, and that's what will load up when it comes back in. Back over here, use internal load and save dialogues. Yeah, we leave that on because we don't. That's using operating system defaults, and we want to use that. Now on down to the next section is the text settings. Your default font. Out of the box, it's Arial at a height of 25 millimeters. You can change that to any font on your system, any size you want. Just pull the drop down, choose a different font, choose a different size. I find these defaults work because I'm always doing different font sizes anyhow. I'll usually changing the font, so Arial's fine. Set SHX font path. If you have single line fonts on your computer, they don't show up in the regular font browser. So you need to choose the path of where that is at. I don't have any on this system. That's why it says no path configured. But if you do have the SHX fonts, that's how you get to where you can access them. Enable right to left text support. That's like if you're doing Arabic or I think Hebrew or any of those languages that print out from right to left instead of left to right, like English. You would use that. And selection double clicking shows the text edit dialog. The best way is just going to be for me to show you. I'm going to turn that off right now. Come in here, close out of this. And also, I don't know if you noticed, but the screen changed over here. So many options changed over here. My toolbar up top changed when I turned off beginner mode. That happened because I had beginner mode turned off. But anyway, back to the text thing. So we're going to go just type testing and click out of there, escape. All right. So I don't have that checked right now. So if I double click it, that brings the cursor back up into this line. I'll hit again. Enter. All right. So say we've done that. I escaped twice to get out. So now I want to come in here and edit it. If I have to double click, and then I can click wherever I want the font or the cursor to go in the text box. I can edit it from there. But go back into settings, if I turn that back on, now when I double click on it, it brings up this Edit Text Shape dialog box, which gives me a little more control over what I can do in here. And you can change the fonts and the size and all these other features from within this dialog box instead of having to go from up top. One thing I really like about this dialog box versus working from up here, say if you have design right here and I want to change the font, well, now I can run through and change it. It changes behind there as I'm scrolling, but I can't see it. Whereas if I double click on it and use this text box, I can move this out of the way and have the same function, but I can actually see because I have the ability to move this anywhere I need to on the screen, and it won't hide my text. So that's it for that feature. Back here, we've went through everything on the editor settings screen. Now let's go to the Units and Grids tab. Units, starting out here. First off, what machine are you using? If you're using a diode laser, you're almost always going to want to be running in millimeters per minute. If you're using a CO2 or a galvo, you're almost always going to be wanting in millimeters per second. There's a difference of 60x between these two settings. So, because there's 60 seconds in a minute. And I do recommend running in millimeters for everything. You don't need to run it in inches. I know a lot of us here in America especially are used to doing things in inches. I won't say millimeters are more precise, but millimeters are, your machine speaks in millimeters, and you don't have to think about doing the conversions if you work totally in millimeters. What you can do, and I'll get into that in another video, is you can actually enter things in inches and they'll show up in millimeters. Lightburn does the conversions for you, but I just recommend keeping it in millimeters per minute or millimeters per second, depending on what system you're working with. Now, snapping, snap to objects and snap to grid. I leave those turned on because most of the time I do want to have something snap when I'm moving it around. Grids, low contrast, I want to change that to high contrast. That's better for screen display for my videos. Visual grid spacing, 10 millimeters. Snap distance, 1 millimeter. Selection tolerance, that's how close you have to be to something in order for it to actually click on it. And that's in pixels. And the snap distance is also in pixels. So if you get within 10 pixels of what you're going to, it'll snap. Now down here, the move increments. This is for, if you select an item, you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to move it around. So the way I have mine set is the arrow key itself runs 20 millimeters. That's just a huge, that's my very coarse adjustment. 20 millimeters, click, 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 20 millimeters a shot. If I hold down the shift and use the arrow key, I have it set to 5 millimeters, which is much finer. And then control arrow I have set to 1 millimeter. And there are times where I'll go in and change this multiple times in any one project. If I'm looking to move things a specific distance, I might change the shift arrow to whatever that specific distance is and use that for that project and then move on to the next thing. Going into display menu or display window. Enable anti-aliasing. Let me just get right here into Lightburn and read what that means. This is straight from the Lightburn documentation. Anti-aliasing smooths the appearance of lines on your screen. Enabling anti-aliasing will make your design rendering look much nicer, but increase the demand on your machine. If you notice your computer lagging, especially on older computers or when working with very complex design, try disabling this setting. And that's just a display setting on the screen. Doesn't affect the output of the file at all. It's just a display on the screen. Now, filled rendering, next one down, I have that turned on. That's a controversial one. It's nice because you can actually see on the screen then what is how it's going to engrave if it's in a fill mode. But it also makes it more difficult to select items. If you have multiple layers on top of each other in a project, you're only going to be able to select the top item if filled rendering is turned on. So, reduce motion. That's for, when you're dragging things around the screen, it may judder a little bit. I don't care. That doesn't really matter to me. I leave it off. Use dark background. I don't. I like the white background. Show palette button labels. Actually, let me turn that off and see what changed. Yeah, see, now if I turn that off, all the numbers are gone. So we want to turn that back on. It's just easier if you can work with the number as well. Show full screen line cursor. I do not like this, but I will show you what it does. That puts a cross on your mouse point. You see we've got the lines that are moving around, the little X as I'm moving the mouse around. That can be handy for some alignment issues and stuff. Some people really love that feature. I don't. Therefore, I turn that off. Show rotary enable on main window. If you have a rotary, I suggest leaving that on. That way you can see that when it's enabled or not. Show cylinder correction enable on main window. That only applies to galvos. Show work area center cross. There again, that just puts another, I'll show you here quickly. That just puts a permanent cross in your work area just so you can see where center actually is. I don't need that either. I just leave that off. And then down here in the very bottom, your cursors and nodes. That will change to, if you're working in a node editor, it'll change the size of the nodes. It will change the size of some of the cursors, have little extra things on them. Toolbar icon size, you can change the size of your icons. Leave that normal. And you can change your font size to huge, back down to default. And now, one bug I've noticed is when you do that, you have to actually restart Lightburn to get it back to normal. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'll be right back. Okay, restarted Lightburn. So that's it for the display window. Now we go into import export. Group imported shapes. I like to have that turned on because sometimes I'll import multiple files on top of each other, and if they come in ungrouped, when you go to move one, because they'll pile up on top of each other and they'll pile up on top of each other. So if they come in ungrouped, you may not be able to move them and separate them. You have to do them individually. So if you group it as they come in, then there's just one item. You can grab that whole group and move it out and ungroup or whatever if you need to. Import hidden layers from Adobe Illustrator files. I leave that turned on because the layer's there for a reason. I may or may not need it, but I'd like to at least be able to see it. Select imported shapes. Once I do the last item that was imported, it's going to be selected and I can immediately start working with it, moving it around. Allow importing to tool layers. That's not really an issue for me, but I leave it turned on because I might want to put something in a tool layer on import rather than import it and then move it elsewhere. Now we go down to DXF import settings. I don't typically use DXF files, but I don't know a lot about this, so I'm not going to get into too much. But I leave auto detect. This is for the default settings, I believe. DXF export. If you're exporting it as a DXF, you want to export as arcs, or you can convert arcs to lines. There again, I don't use that feature, so I don't have answers for you there. SVG import settings. This is one that can trip you up pretty quickly. I have mine set to 72 DPI Illustrator because I use Illustrator on my system. What will happen, or the other is 96 DPI, which is the Inkscape default, and apparently also Canva, because I had a file that I got from someone to create, and they had created the project in Canva. When I imported it, I didn't pay attention to size, and it was actually too big when I went to burn it, and I wasted some material because I didn't pay attention to it to make sure it was the proper size. So I had to, when I switched over to 9060 API and re-imported it, it did come in at the proper size at that point. So you just need to be aware if something isn't the right size, if it's too big or too small, you may need to come in here and switch these settings and re-import it, and that should solve that. This HPGLPLT, I have no idea what that is either. The document says, determines the precision of files imported from HGPL or PLT format. There again, if you don't use it, it doesn't matter. Now, curve tolerance, that's one down here. Curve tolerance specifies the maximum amount of error allowed when projects are output to your laser. So this does affect the output to your laser. The lower the value, the more accurate the curve will be. A value of 0 would be perfect, but would create very dense data as some layers can only process line segments. Would create very dense data as some lasers can only process line segments. Most users will find leaving this at the default value of 0.05 works well. So we leave that where it's at. And then the final tab here is camera. I don't have or use a camera, so I can't speak to any of the settings in here. I mean, just if you get a camera, you'll have to go. That's where you do some of the settings in here. There you have an overview of the settings menu in Lightburn. This is just one video in my Newbies Guide for Lightburn video series. My next video, I believe, is going to be on the device settings menu. So we'll get into some of the settings that are more specific depending on which device and which type of device you have. Subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up and get the notification when a new video comes out. Leave a comment if there's something that I missed or that whatever. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. So give the video a like, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.